Transportation Plan Technical Working Group meeting for Wednesday, April 30th at 11:03. So we'll just go ahead and I'll get us started with some introductions. So I will just call names as they appear on my screen. You can just go ahead and unmute yourself and give a, say who you are and who you're with. But yeah, so hopefully I will get everyone names. We might jump around. So if I miss anyone, we can catch you at the end. So I'm Hannah Oden. I'm a planning manager over at PAG. And the first name on my list is Anona.
Hello, I'm Anona Miller. I'm at the University of Arizona as the commuter programs coordinator.
Awesome. Welcome, Anona. And next is Chris Joannes.
Morning, Chris Joannes with Kimley Horn. I'm the consultant project manager for the RATP.
Perfect. And then Davida.
Hi, I'm Davida Mueller. I'm the Director of Service Planning at Centran.
Perfect. Thanks for joining, Davida. And then Dion.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Dion Swartz. I am the traffic manager at the town of Marana.
Awesome. Welcome, Dion. And next is Dustin.
Hi, everyone. Dustin Fitzpatrick, PAG Environmental Planning Administrator.
Thanks, Dustin. And then Nalo.
Thank you, Hannah. Morning, everyone. I'm Nalo. I'm the Public Works Director, Town Engineer for the town of Sarita.
Hey, thanks for joining, Nalo. Jeanette.
Good morning, everyone. This is Jeanette Duran, Transportation Planning Director at PAG.
Hey, thanks, Jeanette. And then Jennifer Hobart.
Good morning. This is Jennifer Hobart. I'm a regional transportation planner with the ADOT Multimodal Planning Division.
Hey, thanks for joining, Jennifer. And then Jonathan Crow.
Good morning, everybody. Jonathan Crow with Pima County Department of Transportation.
Hey, thanks, Jonathan. And Jose Rodriguez.
Good morning. Jose Rodriguez, Town of Oro Valley.
Hey, thanks, Jose. Kristen.
Good morning, everyone. Kristen Faltz with Kimley Horn.
Thanks, Kristen. Nico.
Hi, Nico Geraldo, Transportation Planner with PAG.
Thanks, Nico. And then Stephen Dean. And Stephen, if you are speaking, you are muted. All right. Still not hearing you, but welcome. Thanks for joining. And then last, or maybe I think I did miss. Oh, Ryan.
Hi, Ryan Fagan, City of Tucson.
Great, thanks, Ryan. And Lydia Barker.
Hello, Lydia Barker. I'm a planner with the City of Tucson Department of Transportation and Mobility.
Great, thanks, Lydia. And then we also have our admin and tech support that are, they'll keep us moving, and if any issues come up, they'll help take care of that. But they'll make sure this meeting runs smoothly. So thanks to Bree, Don, Jesse, and Yisa. Was there anyone that I missed? Go ahead and unmute yourself if so. All right, I think I got everyone. So we will move on to the next agenda item, which is our in-kind reporting. So I'll just go ahead and read this. So regional planning efforts are enhanced by recording time donated by attendees, volunteers, and participants. PAG collects data on the time dedicated to meetings and activities to apply for use as matching funds for grants and federal dollars. If you are paid with federal dollars, please let us know now. Great, time spent in preparation for this meeting will be estimated by PAG staff who are knowledgeable of the agenda and meeting materials. At the conclusion of this meeting, the session report will automatically calculate your time spent in this meeting. Time spent working on PAG, RAT initiatives, programs, and special projects may also be eligible for consideration for matching funds. All right, and then we can move on to agenda item number 3, so the planning process progress. So I will turn it over to Chris, and Chris, you should be able to share your screen with the presentation.
Great, yeah, I'm actually going to have Kristen share it so we don't have to bounce back and forth.
Yeah, it looks like I just had to send a request. There we go.
Okay.
Okay.
There we go. All right, well, welcome everybody, and thank you for your continued input and time spent on this project. You go to the next slide, Kristen. Just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about, share some schedule updates with you. On the project, we're going to push it out a little bit here, and then we're going to talk through the results of our strategic network package alternatives analysis. And thank you everybody for providing input on that who did. It was very helpful. We're going to share with you then our draft preferred high priority network. So Kristen will talk us through what was included in our ultimate preferred network. And then that's what we're trying to get input from you on both today and over the next week and a half or so is input on that high priority network. And then I'll talk through the next steps at the end. Next slide. So talking about the schedule here, we were initially going to end by the end of June, but to accommodate additional technical working group meetings and more back and forth with PAG, we've decided to extend it out to somewhere in September at this point. And essentially what that allows us to do is every step of the way, we're going to have a virtual technical working group meeting with you all. So initially we only had the one planned that we did last time, which was on the network packages. And then we weren't going to have one again until the draft report. So what we've done is added two more supplemental technical working group meetings in there. The first one of which is today, where we're going to review the results of the network package alternatives, as well as our draft preferred network. And then in June, we're expecting to come back to the technical working group again and debut to you our initial projects list. So as a reminder, what we're developing right now is the preferred network. And then the next step will be to go back and look at what are the projects that would bring that network up to a context appropriate standard for active transportation improvements. So our corridor ID and evaluation, that's the task that's getting extended out here. We'll go into July. Simultaneously, we're working on air quality benefits. So that'll be run on both three alternative network packages as well as the preferred network to identify what the potential air quality benefits would be. And then starting in July is when we'll develop our draft RATP document that will go out to you as our technical working group in draft form for review and comment, as well as the public as we go through the review and adoption process here in summer. All right, next slide. One thing that we wanted to add in here, because it was a request from a couple member agencies, was, as you know, we ran our analysis on the three network package scenarios. And then when we got the results of those, we decided to do a geographic division of that to make sure that we had projects around the entire metro region. But we heard from you something you would like to see was the original results of that showed the entire region as kind of one big area. So we went ahead and included them here in this presentation so you can see what they look like. Kristen, correct me if I'm wrong, they're also in the web map that we sent out that Hannah provided to you for your review. And these maps will also be included in the ultimate RATP document as well. So just wanted to show you quickly here what those look like before we get into our next discussion. So you can go to the next slide, Kristen. So our first scenario, if you'll think back, was the maximizing safety scenario. So you can see here, starting from orange down to yellow, those are our top 100 segments based on this analysis, with orange being top 25, green being 25 to 50, blue 50 to 75, yellow 75 to 100. So without playing with, what geographic area these fall into, this was the raw result of that. One thing you'll notice in this is the east-west arterials coming from downtown to the eastern side of Tucson. There's quite a few high priority segments in there. Additionally, southern Tucson, south of the I-19, I-10 interchange, quite a few segments popped up there. Another thing you'll notice is there's very few segments outside of central and southern Tucson. So nothing in the northern part of the region, Oro Valley, Marana area, not much in the foothills area, not much on the southeast side of town or the far south. And so, yeah, those are key takeaways from that first one. Moving to the next scenario, which was maximizing accessibility. So this one was purposefully trying to push the network a little further out by prioritizing access for all kinds of different trips. So compared to the last scenario, what you'll see is more north-south segments show up here than east-west. There's also a higher concentration right in the downtown area than we saw in the safety scenario. And a few more segments to the east and north of downtown than we had in the previous scenario. And then last is our maximizing the need-based connectivity. So this one focused really heavily on equity and demographics. And what you'll see here is a much higher concentration in southern Tucson and the southwest portion of Pima County that's at the fringe of the urban development. Far fewer segments in downtown and then to the east and north of downtown. And again, a few more segments in kind of the far south and southeast portions. But so you can see kind of broad strokes from all of them. All the scenarios are relatively highly focused on the central part of town. Just depending on what metrics we put our thumb on the scale for, it did move around which segments popped up specifically, but broadly the trends are central Tucson, southern Tucson, and then some portions of like Midtown and heading out towards the eastern side of town, depending on which area we looked at. So again, we are proceeding with using our geographic breakouts ultimately, but we did want to provide you these results so that you have these when you're doing reviews of where active transportation treatments may go within your specific jurisdiction. But yeah, I see a couple questions. I think Ryan's was first. You want to go ahead first, Ryan?
Yeah, my first question is just so I understand the ultimate outcome of this with priority segments and project recommendations. Is that going to have any bearing on funding that goes through PAG, or is this merely a sort of going to be a reference for member jurisdictions and others?
Yeah, Hannah or Jeanette, I'll defer to you since I know you guys have been asked this question a couple times, so I'll let you handle the response there.
Sure, yeah, I can go and get started, and Jeanette, please feel free to chime in. But yeah, so with these particular projects, as far as being eligible for any funding that is facilitated through PAG, that would be through the RMAP. So any projects from the RMAP, those would be eligible for funding that PAG facilitates. Jeanette, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, at the base level, that's accurate. So ideally, we'd get all these projects listed in the long range plan, and they would be eligible. That doesn't limit us from putting additional projects in the long range plan as well, as we have done in previous RMAPs. But we would want to make sure that all of these are listed in the long range plan. That way, they could be considered for funding when the time comes to program dollars to projects. But there's we don't have any indication from our decision-making boards that those projects would be prioritized for any like tip funding or anything like that. So that's not part of this plan process. That would be part of the programming process. But ideally, at the the first cut is to make sure that these get into the next long range plan. So that project list will probably be developed in about 2 years.
So Thank you for that. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, is a project that ends up in the final version of the RATP that, may end up in the RMAP or wherever else. Is that going to give it an advantage over projects that do not end up in it? Because, I just want to understand, it's going to inform sort of maybe additional questions and comments that I have about this because, I know that there are serious concerns. I'm one of the people who has concerns about the decision to split the region up into 9 sub areas because that really distorts the output of the analysis. I mean, as we can see with looking at the top 100 region-wide segments, I mean, it doesn't look in, there's very little relationship between this and the projects or the segments that come up when you split up the region. And in fact, the exact boundaries of where those, where those regions are, if you move those around, you totally change which segments rise to the top in some areas. So, I'm going to be blunt here and I'm going to say I feel like that is a fatal flaw with this process. And if there's any reason that, the city of Tucson has a project that, we want through our, RTA funds or something that goes through you all, and it didn't make it into the RATP because of the way that this analysis was, the thumb was put on the scale, as Chris put it, kind of. That's a problem, and that I think will require us to take a step back and consider whether or not this is workable and this is something that we can support.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair concern, but the selection criteria that go out in our NOFAs are decided at the time that they put out a NOFA, right? So each funding source has their own criteria and then those are set up. So, the purpose of this plan is to make sure that we identify projects that meet these specific categories, that are providing access, that are providing safety. So we know that. And we make sure that those, as we've discussed here, these priority areas are not projects. These are just demand areas. So as we develop projects for the preferred list, ideally, that tells a story of these projects are going to achieve these goals. That's why they were selected. The funds, how the funds are split, for instance, when RTA funds become available to do active transportation projects, at that point, that's when they'll decide what are the selection criteria. I can guarantee that there's not going to be a selection criteria that weighs heavily on one jurisdiction over the other. It's never the regional approach. So that's why it's important to identify projects all over the region. There's also funds that are specifically dedicated to areas that are not urban. And so if that becomes the case, we want to make sure that there's projects available that achieve these goals that are located throughout the entire region. So this document is not suggesting any sort of funding selection, prioritization in terms of, these projects should get funded first. All it's suggesting is these projects achieve a certain goal and they should be identified in our long range plan. That way they are able to receive funding. So if they're left out, then they won't get that funding, right? So in our long range plan, specifically in the one that we're working on right now, we've been real general and broad to make sure that when projects do pop up, when they are available by any of our jurisdictions, that they are able to receive funds. We don't want to limit it, but we also want to make sure that we're telling the story of which projects we know will achieve certain outcomes. And that's the purpose of this plan.
Thank you. I appreciate the explanation. And just a quick follow-up question. So, you mentioned we want to make sure that we have, projects in rural areas and elsewhere so that they're in these long range plans so that they're eligible for funding. My concern is that by limiting, say, the central core and the south side and these areas that regionally, way much more heavily, but only get 10 segments. My concern is that we'll have worthy projects that don't end up in these long range plans that make them eligible for funding. And so my request would be on behalf of the city that the top 100 segments that were identified region-wide, that those be included along with all the segments that rose to the top 10 in each of the 9 regions. I think that will create a much more accurate picture of where there is need and where there's opportunity for projects that'll benefit the most people, as well as, ensuring coverage, in the more suburban and rural areas.
Sure. And I think as we identify projects, which is the next phase of what Chris and Kristen are going to lead us through, throughout the summer, we'll start to see that come together. And then obviously as a group, we'll make a recommendation to the TPC. So I think we'll see how it unfolds and what we arrive at. But yeah, that's one of the advantages of having Chris and Kristen on board, is to help us navigate through all that. It looks like Dion and Jonathan have their hands up. I think Dion, you were first.
Thank you, Jeanette. Yeah, curious about the network that was evaluated, the extent of that network and how that network was determined in the first place. I'm wondering if maybe that could just be generally discussed and presented.
Yeah, so if you think back to our technical working group meeting we had back in January, we discussed what we were doing with this analysis was limiting it to the arterial network from an analysis standpoint. But as Jeanette was just mentioning, the next step in the process is to define what the actual projects are. Those projects may or may not be directly on the arterial roadway itself. This is just telling us where the major, on the demand side of the equation, where are the major locations that we need to accommodate active transportation movement in some way or another. So it could be, a facility right on the arterial roadway. It could be a bike boulevard adjacent to the roadway, a few blocks off. It could be a trail that follows a wash or a river corridor nearby. The projects aren't going to be limited just to the arterial network. This is telling us at a more broad scale, we need to accommodate trips, moving east-west somewhere near, Twin Peaks Road, for example. So
yeah,
as we move into the, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I do remember that discussion. I'm kind of more interested in the coverage aspect. When I looked at the spreadsheet that was distributed, it seemed that the coverage had some constraints imposed upon it. So could you talk about that?
Can you explain a little more what you mean by you saw constraints? Because what we did, you can see in the map here, these are the defined arterial roads, and what we did is chop up each segment. So wherever an arterial hits another arterial, those are the 450 or so segments that we had in that analysis.
It seemed like there were no segments evaluated north of Avra Valley Road.
I don't know, Kristen, if you remember offhand. I don't, but I believe anything that's shown in this map was
anything that was like that is an arterial would be in there. If roadways up north of that roadway are not classified as arterials, then they would have not been included in the analysis.
Can you tell me how you determined arterial? Because there's some variation among the different agencies about how that's evaluated. What criteria did you use?
So, Kristen, again, correct me if I'm wrong, we took the federal functional class layer, largely maintained by ADOT.
Yeah.
Okay, so you didn't use the agency's evaluation of what they consider to be an arterial, and instead you use the federal one, because I do have issues with the federal map. I mean, it really doesn't make any sense, to be honest, in many respects.
Right, we went with the federal functional class purely so we have a single region-wide network that aligns. So yeah, that's what we elected to use back at the start of the process.
And you used only arterials? You didn't use like major collectors, or did you use minor arterials and major arterials and principal arterials, and you left out the major collectors?
Correct. Yep. All arterials and left out major collectors.
Okay, yeah, because some roads that I consider to be an arterial, the ADOT or the federal functional class considers to be a collector, or major collector maybe. I mean, really, when you're chopping it so fine, a major collector versus a minor arterial, really inconsequential differences as far as that goes. I think that limits the roadway network that was evaluated.
Yeah, we and I think where it gets more critically important is that project development phase that we're going to be going into next, to make sure that if there's a roadway or a corridor or a travel pattern that that there's a lot of activity and might have been left out due to us doing this analysis on the arterials, we definitely want to hear at that point, this is a really important corridor that feeds into the broader system, and we can try to accommodate those projects being added in there at that time.
Yeah, and Deanne, we also recognize that you guys have a lot of construction going on right now and a lot of residential development up there that might not, those roads might not be completed. So that's important information to share with us, especially if you guys know that there's portions of roads that, will be added to that network here in the next few years as those developments build out.
Yeah, I'm always frustrated with functional class because there's different interpretations of functional class. And it's hard to say the difference between a major collector and a minor arterial, for example.
Yeah, and it is a little tough fast growing areas at the urban edge. Usually that federal functional class is a little bit behind because ADOT's not proactively changing those, right? They're reacting to requests to change those. So could be, something that was a collector 5 years ago now functions as an arterial, but
yeah. And it almost seems a bit arbitrary, like they've got some sort of formula that they need to apply. I remember about 5-7 years ago where they had a project, ADOT did, where they needed to increase the number of collectors in their system. And so they were taking roads that the city of Tucson considered to be local roads and classifying them as collectors. And it just struck me as arbitrary.
Yeah, I believe there's federal guidance on what the percentage of the overall road mileage is supposed to be for each functional class, which, yeah, is a little funky. You think it should be more, based on the function of the road in the network. But yeah, they did do a rebalancing several years ago. But they do, it's constantly evolving as they get requests to update functional classifications. Okay. Jonathan, I think you had the next hand up.
Thanks. So I guess, my biggest concern, or one of my concerns, is that with all three maps that you've just shown here, the listing of, top 10 projects or eligible projects is really tiny. I mean, it's really limited mostly to the central Tucson core. And, the county, we don't support this methodology and we don't support this results. I understand that these aren't the projects. The projects will be different and they may not be located on the arterials shown, but the methodology just does not make sense whatsoever. And I think if, from PAG's point of view, Jeanette and Hannah, the litmus test with the public is going to be thumbs down. I mean, it just doesn't relate to what people's experience and knowledge is of the region as to what an important safety project or an accessibility project might be. If we start with just these three maps and list those projects that are shown as the basis for then moving into projects, then to me, that implies that we're going to be missing out of any other project that we might want to suggest outside of the colored lines shown on these maps. And I know, Chris, you just said that if we think that we're missing a project that we need to add in, that's sort of a go around or a way to kind of, patch this thing up to make it a little better. But then it raises the question of why use the methodology and the criteria that you guys have used to develop this list if it doesn't really represent what the jurisdictions feel are the most important safety projects or the most important accessibility projects or whatever. So, I don't expect to solve this problem right now, and I'm sorry I have to be so critical, but it really just fails in every way, shape, and form. And so I know, Jeanette, you said, let's just wait and see how this pans out. And that's kind of what we've been doing all along. So that's probably what you're going to say now. But at this point, the county wouldn't support this report and this process moving forward. And I hope we get to something better, but I'm just not I'm not seeing it right now. So
Yeah, thanks for that, Jonathan. And actually, no, that's not what I'm going to say right now. I think the last meeting showed a division of the region to show projects all over the region, and that is definitely the approach that Hannah and I recommend. We've showed these past three maps just as a request from this group in the prior round. So, active transportation projects and active transportation usage, as you're well aware, Jonathan, those are shorter trips, right? People aren't going to be taking their bike and riding all the way down Oracle Road or riding all the way across Ina Road for miles and miles. There are people that do that, a lot of recreational riders, but when we're talking about getting trips to shift off of the roads, from automobiles onto active transportation, ideally the easiest trips to capture are shorter ones, right? Where people are comfortable walking for, a mile or less, or maybe they're okay riding their bike for 5 miles or less. So I think that was the intent of originally splitting up the region because, when you're looking at Marana, for instance, trying to capture projects and areas where trips might be able to make that transition into active modes, those riders and those walkers are not going to be coming from Oro Valley. They're not going to be coming from unincorporated county. They're going to be coming from the neighborhoods in Marana, for instance, going to their new downtown area that's being developed. Same thing down in the southern portion, down in the Green Valley Sahuarita area. So that was our original intent and why we presented that as our recommendation at the last meeting. So we can really capture, what are projects everywhere in the region that can take those shorter trips and move them onto onto the active transportation network. This also, when we're talking about this is showing, like I said, demand. So we also know that there are projects in these areas that are on the books. There's projects that have been recently completed that hit some of these neighborhoods and some of these areas. And there's also projects that are nearby that might be already existing that might be capturing some of the trips that we're seeing on these three maps. I think a great example of that is River Road, right? Like, so we know there's probably not a lot of actual bikes and pedestrians on River Road because they're going to hit the loop. And that might be the recommendation we have, is to, maybe enhance connections to the loop and direct most of those trips onto the loop. So that's what I'm saying. As we develop the projects, we'll see kind of how that plays out. I don't know that we'll say, let's put a cycle track down River Road. That might not be a viable option, but you guys might have some thoughts on, best ways to divert more of those trips onto the loop, enhancements to the loop that could be made, other adjacent facilities that might also help create connectivity, but that are servicing that demand for active transportation in those areas. So anyway, that was our approach and why you're seeing these maps today. But certainly, decision that's going to be made by this working group and then onto the TPC.
Yeah, and just to reinforce what you said at the beginning, Jeanette, we're showing these as information that this group requested to see, and we're providing it in the web map and will be in the final report for you all as you respond to NOFAs from PAG, to say, look, this was a high priority segment. when we did the full regional analysis, but we are still going forward with the methodology of breaking out the region into sub areas. And so the next couple slides here, Kristen's going to go through is actually the result of the 3 network scenarios done by the geographic areas, and responding to all the comments we got from this group as part of that exercise. And so, yeah, I didn't want you, Jonathan, to think that this was the new network we're going off of. This is more just kind of more information for your toolboxes, your reviewing projects that you do, internally in your agency, or when you're looking at applying for regional funds as kind of another data point to include in that application. Ryan?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess my question is, this was the response to the request for, sort of the more raw results before they were split up region wide. Is it possible? I mean, in what circumstance would there be an opportunity to actually change the methodology or modify what you're planning on? Because it sounds like there were requests to look at some other ways of doing this, including what we're seeing now. But it sounds like they've been discarded, and I'm just wondering, does this body have the power to actually influence how that methodology is being done, or is this just a show and tell?
We, as we take comments, we've been following back up with PAG step by step to make sure that they're comfortable with how we're moving forward with the methodology. I don't know, Hannah or Jeanette, if there's anything you want to add as far as requests to change the methodology. We've done, some changes here and there as we go. And if you have specific requests for changing a geographic area or something like that, we'd love to hear it in your feedback. And we have made quite a few changes to our network, our scenario networks as we've gone in response to changes or requests from the group. So Jeanette, that's how you go off mute, so I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think that's one reason we extended the project schedule on this one is to look at those options. And I know that our consultants at Kimley can kind of tell us a little bit about, changes to the methodology and will that show a significant difference. We've noticed that, we've talked through some tweaks here and there, but at the end of the day, they're not going to result in a difference to what we're seeing in the 3 scenarios. So yeah, I mean, we're always welcome to ideas and thoughts on that. And I know Kimley works with their sub-consultants as well to kind of talk through some of those ideas. And so of course that's all on the table right now. But be prepared. I mean, I know Chris and Kristen and others will be able to tell us, if we tweak things, are we really going to see much of a difference? And I think that's where we are conscientious of our time and of our consultants' time, that we're not, making little differences, and we know darn well it's going to end up with a very, very much the same result. So I think we noticed that when we were talking about in the safety scenario and looking at crashes, they're very there were a lot of them in certain areas, but they're not a lot on specific segments. So you have to kind of look a little bit at a larger area to kind of really see what's going on. So there's things like that that could or could not really make much of a difference in what the results are going to show. But yeah, I mean, there's time now. That's one of the reasons why we've kind of taken some time to add into the project schedule so that we can, continue to look at that.
Thanks. Yeah, I guess, you talk about little tweaks here and there, but I mean, the maps that we were just shown, those are massively different than what it seems like we're being told is going to be the way that it's done. And, you've got the 2 largest jurisdictions representing the vast majority of people in the region who have expressed serious concerns with the decision and the way that it was done to split up the region. I feel like that merits additional discussion and reconsideration of that approach, honestly, or alternate ways of bringing other projects to the top, like for example, putting the top 100 regional projects on the same footing. But I'd have to go back and look, but I believe in an email that we sent a few weeks back, we suggested one opportunity. One option might be to split it up by jurisdiction and look at it that way, because splitting up by I'm sure that the boundaries are well considered, but they look arbitrary, and when you move them around, you change which projects rise to the top. I mean, that just seems like it's skewing the underlying analysis so much that I don't have confidence in the outcome of that when you're essentially saying, well, we know that the top projects were in the central core and the southwest side, but we didn't like that, so we wanted to spread it out across the region. And of course, this should be a regional plan. It should be identifying things regionally, but it seems like we're being told that that we have to deprioritize the areas that we know have the highest need, and I just don't understand why that's being hand waved away.
Sure. First thing, we're not deprioritizing these areas. As we move into the next section here, you'll see that we have high priority networks in central Tucson, in the southern area and southwest part of the county. It doesn't, we've added quite a few segments to that in response to comments based on the kind of overall rank of the segments in the regional analysis. So I don't know that I'd characterize that as de-emphasizing just yet. When we can't just leave large parts of the region out of the process.
I agree.
By concentrating it onto.
I agree, but I feel like that points to maybe a problem with the underlying methodology rather than the fact that the underlying methodology didn't show things regionally, so we had to make it look regional. But when you look at these maps that are the top 100 segments, and they show the greatest need is in this central area, when you're saying, well, you can only have 10 segments in these regions, these couple of regions that represent that area, that is deprioritizing them, and that is taking them more off the table. And unless we're going to also consider the top 100 segments region-wide and on top of the ones that are split up by region. And this is, for me at this point, this is sort of me bargaining and going, how can we get to something that is more useful and more equitable? Because it seems like we're gonna, it seems like we don't have a lot of control over this process, but I just want to make sure that the areas that do have the highest need are all represented, in addition to ones that satisfy a sort of need for coverage region-wide as well.
Yeah, and one clarification there is we're not limiting these areas to 10 segments. What we initially did was we used the top 10 segments in each area to help inform the original networks, or the scenario networks. The scenario networks have far more than 10 segments in them each. And I think it would help, Kristen, actually, if we can move to the next section and start looking at the results of those, to show you that we do have quite a few segments in a lot of these areas that were of concern, both when we did the regional analysis, when we did the analysis by sub-area, and then moving into the prioritized network. I know, and Jeanette, or Hannah can maybe speak to this a little more. Initially, we did transition to, top projects by jurisdiction, and then ultimately elected to move to more of a geography-based approach rather than single jurisdiction. I don't know, Hannah and Jeanette, if you want to provide input on the reasoning behind that.
Sure. So when we discuss these different regions, like sub-regions, if you will, Southwest, Southeast, Far West, Northwest, etc., we were looking at where it was logical for those trips to be captured, right? So there certainly are trips in unincorporated Pima County that would feed into Marana or feed into Oro Valley or feed into the Sahuarita far south area. So we didn't want to split it up by jurisdiction because that's, the political line is kind of arbitrary when it comes to where people are walking and where people are biking. There's some natural barriers, right? The highway, pretty natural barrier. Not a lot of people are going to be crossing that. There's also, just employment centers and neighborhoods, and there's things that are drawing trips. So we did our best to kind of look at, where are those natural breaks? Where do we feel the trips are going to go? Where are those people going to bike to? And we didn't want to arbitrarily cut them off because a portion of it wasn't incorporated, for instance. So that was the thought behind that, is really looking at what's going on the ground. What is the land use showing? What are the development patterns showing? And how can we make sure that those are grouped together in a way that makes sense from the traveling public standpoint? There's some areas that are a little bit tricky to do that, because they are further out. So like the Southwest area, for instance, the far West area, for instance, those are going to be kind of difficult to capture because there's probably not a lot of bike commuting in some of those areas, but we have to put them somewhere. So what looks the most reasonable? And we walked through that with Chris and Kristen and the data that we had and took a swing at that. That's not to say that trips aren't going to go between those regions, and you can see on this map specifically that there are segments that are going between different areas, the urban core in the east, for instance, and you'll see even the projects continuing from the southwest into the south. So yeah, that was the reasoning behind not just doing it strictly on jurisdiction lines. Plus, our regional funding isn't specific to one jurisdiction, so there was no real compelling reason to do it that way.
Sure. No, thanks for that explanation. Excuse me. Thanks for that explanation. I would just say, you refer to, natural barriers, things like rivers and freeways, but those are the areas where I think we actually might need to direct some of the most investment, because, we can bridge those barriers. And I think it's, I'm glad to see that this map shows a lot of those, crossing freeways and other barriers. But that actually seems like something we'd want to emphasize is actually, how do we get people across those barriers? Because, people aren't crossing I-10 because it's difficult. People aren't crossing the Rito River where there's not a bridge near them because they can't. I would just want to make sure that we are actually emphasizing the need for those connections and not just saying, well, that's already a barrier, so let's keep it a barrier.
No, they were just kind of selected from a standpoint of where are we likely to get folks to get to their shopping, their schools, and those sorts of trips. But yeah, you got to draw the line somewhere on there. But yeah, I think this shows specifically the need for some of those connections to get folks, to different areas for sure. And we'll see how that, we can support that with our project selection in the next phase.
Thank you.
Right. Kristen, I'll let you take over to start talking through the kind of where we wound up on the network packages.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so starting off with maximizing safety, these all should look pretty familiar to you all since these are just updated packages of what you guys recently reviewed on the web map. So an overall summary of what we changed based on your comments in the last round is we had previously excluded some segments based on, if there's any potential active transportation activity, if it doesn't really connect to any activity centers, or it doesn't seem like a good corridor for travel to and from destinations. We had previously removed those, but based on your comments, we did add that back into these packages. So you'll see that majority of our top 10 identified segments, which are the segments with kind of the gray border behind the package line work, are now filled in the package network. And then here's the updated maximizing accessibility network package. And a lot of those added segments too are specifically in kind of the west side, like looking at Avra Valley Road, and then some connections on Silver Bell. And then finally, maximizing our need-based connectivity network package. Similar thing here, just filling in additional gaps. And with all these updates, I just want to mention that really no segments were taken away from any of the packages. It was just added to, so they all just got bigger based on your comments. Any initial thoughts on that before we move into the preferred high priority network? Leon?
Yeah, when I was reviewing this, I noticed that Cortero Road was kind of removed frequently from the package. And I had guessed maybe that was because of a future traffic interchange being constructed at Cortero and I-10, and it was removed for practicality. I'm wondering if that guess was correct.
That is not why we excluded it. I think similarly, it was just because of kind of the lack of like crossing for I-10, but we did go ahead and add that back in. So
Yeah, I'll add to that just a little bit. Was, you know, when you look at it on the map like this, it looks like it just kind of dead ends at the freeway. But Deanne, because of your comments, we went back and looked at that location specifically more closely. And there is that really large shopping center there that is probably a driver for quite a few active transportation trips or short distance trips, I should say. And so we went ahead and added that back into all the packages because it was popping up. And I think it was a really good add to include that back in because it does provide a connection across a barrier, which is the river, between residential areas and that shopping center.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
thanks. Any other thoughts on the updated packages before we move on? Okay. So moving into discussing the preferred high priority network results. So this does take into account the updated packages that we just reviewed. And so just want to kind of discuss how we went about developing this. So our methodology started out by looking at our 3 packages, and then for any segments that were included in 2 or more network packages, those were automatically kind of funneled into our preferred network package segments. Then from there, based on the comments that you provided in your last review of the network packages, I know that there were some comments that weren't necessarily on kind of, you know, top 10 locations or things like that, but we're saying, hey, you know, I think that this segment should really be included and it's not popping up in the analysis. We went ahead and then funneled those comments and those segments straight into our preferred network package. So you may not see those reflected in the additional network packages, but they are included in the preferred. And then from there, we added connection segments between all of the segments that we had already previously identified and selected the corridors that could connect the segments to get a well-connected network, but also had the highest ranking overall for each package. And then Ryan, did you have a question?
Yeah, so the city of Tucson, you know, we did not, unless Ben or Lydia went rogue, and I wasn't included, but I'm pretty sure we did not request any additional segments because we had questions and concerns about the methodology. So do we have an opportunity to go back and request those additional segments? Because you know, we also didn't have those top 100 locations to look at either to help, you know, guide additional requests, and otherwise we'd just be going from our gut basically.
Yes, no, definitely. And that's one thing too, is we will show you our draft preferred network right now, but stressing on that it is a draft and And that is what we want to hear from you during this next review period while you guys have the web map, is, are there additional segments that are missing in your opinion? Are there segments that are popping up that maybe aren't a priority for you? And so maybe we remove it from the package. And then of the segments that we have identified, are there any alternative routes that you think would be better to show as we move forward into project development? So yes, definitely want comments and additional segments on the draft.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. And so I will pop up the high priority network here. I'm going to switch over real quick to the web map because I just feel like that might be a little easier to talk through together. Are you guys able to see that on my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Cool. So here is our preferred network package as it stands right now. So based on the updated packages that we took a look at, you'll see a lot of those segments are carried through that popped up just because a lot of the network packages resulted in a lot of similar segments. So a lot of those were carried through, as well as some additional segments that were based on locations that were called out in your last review of the network packages, and then some additional segments to make those key connections as well and make it a comprehensive and connected network. So like I had mentioned, really what we're looking for from you during this next review period is what segments might be missing. Is there like maybe an arterial that's popping up? Is there either a more appropriate arterial that you'd rather kind of shift that to for the preferred network, or is there like a collector or local road that you think would be more appropriate that we can then pull through during project development? And then also, are there any segments that are popping up that you don't actually see to be a priority that we want to maybe remove from the preferred network? And so I think Chris will go into more detail on when we are requesting comments back, but the web map is all up to date. So you can look at the preferred network, you can look at our updated packages and the associated top 10, and you can also look at the regional segments just to help your review. So I guess as you guys are looking at this, are there any overarching comments so far on the preferred network, outside of the more extensive review and commenting that will occur in the next, I think, week? Okay, well, if not, as you guys review, please just reach out to us or Hannah or Jeanette if you have any kind of questions. And then also, we're more than happy to take your comments and implement it in the updated version of the preferred network that will be coming after that review period. Okay, I will switch back to the PowerPoint and then I'll hand it back over to Chris to talk through next steps.
All right, thanks, Kristen. You can go to the next slide. So just to look at what's coming up here over the next few months. So here, end of April, beginning of May, we're trying to gather all comments on that initial draft priority network. We'd like to get those comments by May 9th if possible, just to keep us on track with our updated schedule here. So we sent it out at the beginning of the week, hoping to get comments by the end of next week. If there's a really big issue with that, just reach out to Hannah and Jeanette. But ideally, we'd love to get your comments back on that initial draft preferred network by May 9th. The next step after we do that will be to update that preferred network and then begin developing projects. So what we'll do is Kimberly Horn will take a couple weeks to develop the initial project list. We'll then give PAG a couple weeks to review and give us suggestions or changes on that. And then once we implement those, we'll bring that back out to the technical working group again. So I would expect, late June to be getting that initial list of projects that are associated with the preferred network locations. And so that's when we'll set up another meeting and talk again about results of the preferred network in our initial project list and how we went about that. As we get to that point, we're also going to want to do our second round of public and stakeholder engagement here over the summer. So that will also include the draft project list. We want to put that out to the public and get input on, whether they like the projects, don't like the projects, want to give us feedback on, potentially the countermeasure we developed or the facility type that we're recommending. So that will happen this summer. In the meantime, while we're going through our preferred network refinement and our project list development, we're going to be doing our air quality benefits analysis. That's going on in the background as we speak. And then finally, starting in June through August, we'll be developing the draft RATP document. Again, this group will get that early in draft form to provide comments right after PAG has had a chance to review and provide comments. So I'd expect that probably in August, and then we will move for completing the project in mid to late September. So that is all we had for today. Any last comments before we let you go? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much for your time, and I'll hand it back over to Hannah.
All right, thanks so much, Kristen. I really appreciate sharing information. Thank you, everyone, for comments and discussion. Really appreciate it. So we can move on. If there's nothing else from anyone, we can move on to, oh, go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. You mentioned that the member jurisdictions can suggest, the analysis was done on arterials, and you mentioned that we can suggest parallel segments as alternatives. Is that process going to rely entirely on us recommending those to you all, or will the work of developing those projects naturally include identifying alternates to those arterials?
Yeah, no, we're going to take our best crack at it. We have gone through a lot of work to get together projects that are programmed in the near future, as well as projects that have been recommended from previous studies. We want this to be an aggregator of those projects. So that'll be our starting point. Any place there's gaps that we're still not finding previously recommended projects that, match the demand that we're seeing, are in line with best practices, that's where we'll do our best shot to come up with projects that we believe address that need in the most feasible way. But we definitely will be relying on you heavily once you get that draft project list to say, I don't think a bike boulevard works here, it should be on this street, or I think actually we do, protected bike lanes on the arterial instead. So we're gonna take an initial crack at it, but we will definitely be relying on your local expertise to refine those projects for us, or with us, I should say.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right, go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, the county's gonna need more time than May 9th to provide updates and additional projects for the list. Unfortunately, the process that we've used to this point doesn't really provide a lot of useful tools for us to kind of determine from our point of view in our jurisdiction which are the highest priority needs from whatever scenario we're talking about. One of the key pieces of information that I use, and there's lots of information that I will use to prioritize from the county, but simply where there is the existence or the non-existence of, say, bike facilities or sidewalks along streets, and bike facilities come to mind as the easiest proxy. So we don't have that database that has been developed through this process. So it's kind of a manual effort that I have to go through road by road to look at my jurisdiction to see where there are no bike lanes on arterial roads that are candidates for recommendations. And so for that reason, it's going to take me longer than May 9th to get this information to you. The other second point I wanted to make, just to have it on the record, is as I've been watching this and thinking about this, and I don't think we've talked about this before, but even though the loop is not a facility that we're recommending improvements to or identifying in our process, getting to the loop is obviously what we've talked about before. And it's not clear to me that it's represented on any of the maps yet, but I think some of those key routes that provide safe connections to the loop are really important. And, I can envision if those routes, countywide, citywide, Marana-wide, were all provided in a way that people could really get to the loop safely and easily, that could potentially increase, usability by a substantial amount. And the fact that we don't have safe ways to get to the loop for a lot of cyclists in particular, it means that we've either got unsafe conditions out there now, which people are risking, or they're just not choosing to ride to the loop because they just can't get there safely. So, I don't want to emphasize too much the loop, but I think there's a lot of users out there, and there's a lot of potential more users that just aren't using the loop or biking to the loop. They're driving to a parking area to park and get their bike off their car and then ride, because there's just not a safe way to get there. And I think it's kind of an important aspect of this whole study that we shouldn't lose sight on. So that was just kind of a second point I wanted to put on the record today. So thank you.
Yeah. So your first question about the time, all we're really asking for from you by the 9th is comments on the preferred network locations. We're not at the point for projects yet, so don't feel like you need to go through and say, oh, I want bike lanes here, and we're just trying to get the network down first, and then our next step in the process is for us to develop a project list, run it by PAG, make updates, and then give it out to you. So hopefully you're getting a somewhat refined project list. You're not starting from scratch trying to do that on your own. So for the 9th, we're really just focused on the network locations itself. Your second point on the loop, I 100% agree. And so we, trail corridors in general, more broadly from the loop, we absolutely see as alternatives to on-street active transportation. Like I know Jeanette mentioned before, River Road, the ultimate recommendation on River Road may not be to include a facility on River Road. It may be a series of access points between River Road and the surrounding areas and the loop trail, because we already have made that investment in the region and want to facilitate people getting to that quickly, easily, safely. So yes, 100%, we want to leverage the regional trail system. And even if there's locations where there's, a road and a nearby parallel wash, we may want to very seriously consider our recommendation being shared use path along the wash and connectivity over to that roadway corridor rather than a facility on the roadway itself. So yes, we definitely want to be thinking that way.
Don't forget also, Chris, that, in some situations, there's just not a way to get there unless you're using a road. So one of the corridors that's missing, that's going to be one of my recommendations, is not Cotera Farms, but the next northern parallel route, and I'm forgetting the name of the road. Anyway, there's only one way to. Sorry?
Twin Peaks Road?
No. It's just the next east-west arterial north of Cotera Farms McGee.
Linda Vista?
Further north. Anyway, it's approximately near Linda Vista, but it's Overton. Sorry, Overton. So Overton Road doesn't have bike lanes east and west of the loop intersection, and we constantly get requests and complaints from cyclists who don't like riding, can't ride, won't ride, almost get hit riding on Overton Road to get to the loop. And so that's going to be one of the corridors that I'm going to recommend by May 9th to you guys. It needs to have it. It'd be great if there was an off-street trail, like you said, Chris, but in a lot of situations there isn't going to be. So I think the ultimate recommendation there is put bike lanes or some kind of bike facility all along Overton Road, just so that you can have a safe way to get to the loop. So in some cases, you're going to have an on-street or nearly on-street facility to get access to the loop. You can't always rely on having a parallel route that's a trail system. So just a fine point there I wanted to make.
Yep, sounds great.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, we can provide the existing facility information as well that we're working with as part of this project. So if there is nothing else, don't see any other hands up. Again, really appreciate everybody's time. Yeah, and if anything comes up as you're reviewing the high priority network, please don't hesitate to reach out. But we can go ahead and move on to the adjournment, which is the last item on the agenda here. So again, thanks everyone for coming, and we'll be in touch. Thanks so much. Have a good day.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, everybody.